Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christophe Dickès, and I am in charge of copyright for Kantar Media. And I work for AMEC and FIBEP too at the Copyright Committee. We have a group, and we work on all this issue, which is really important for our industry. I am very pleased to present this session because this year we decided to integrate in our session a reflection, ideas about data, because data as copyright is a legal issue. So I will try to define them, and my Jeremy and Andrew will present their views on these two topics. So Jeremy Thompson is Cision CEO for EMEA and India, so he will present the industry side, and you have the other side, which is not the dark side, because we are in the room Moon. It's not the dark side of the moon. It represents the publishers. Andrew Hughes is International Director of Newspaper Licensing Agency, and he is the General Secretary of PDLN. PDLN is a press database licensing network. This is a company which regroups all the right organizations in the world. So they are PDLN is the intermediary between our industry and the publishers. I would like to define first what is copyright and what is data. What are the differences between the two areas? Copyright is very simple. We all integrate in our database media content. Then we copy it. As we copy it, we have to pay copyright. We pay copyright on newspapers, sometimes on broadcast and TV, and sometimes on web content. So we are in a B2B environment. MMEs receive content from media group. And when we send this content to the client sometimes pays a copyright fee. This is intellectual property. What about data? It's very difficult to define what is data. And even from a legal point of view, it's very difficult to define what is personal data. There is a difference between the two terms. All the data are not personal data. To explain, let's have a look on the slide. We are all on Facebook. We all use Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. Each time we use it, we give first our name, our nickname. We give our emails, our own emails, our phone number. But we explain what we like, what we dislike. We publish photo, we publish text, we publish hashtags with our political view, with our religion views, with our tests, simply. This is all personal data. So the question is, to whom belongs this data? Just simple, to you, to the user. You own your own data. So the states are here to protect the user. The law is here to protect your data. So it becomes an issue for us because we can't do without taking into account this legal aspect. This is what Jeremy will present. Jeremy?
Thank you very much, Christophe. So, good afternoon. My name's Jeremy Thompson. I am Chief Executive of Cision, EMEA and India. And I'm thrilled to be here. The first involvement I had with AMEC was running I think we set up the original Copyright and Content Committee, must have been in 07 or 08. So I'm thrilled to be back on stage with the dark side of the moon, who I have to say, we thought, how could we dress up this session and compete with the framework guys next door? And next year, we suggest that we rename this session Sex and Copyright. That was Christophe's suggestion. And then we also thought Andrew maybe could present naked next time. So anyway, watch this space.
Thank you, Jeremy.
You're welcome. So what are we talking about today? I've got sort of two takeaways from this, data and content. I'm not going to speak too much about content because I actually think that, at the end, I'll talk about the future and I'll reflect on the past. I think the relationship that in the UK we've developed with Andrew and the NLA around Europe with the PDLN, I think has actually transformed our access to content. And we've still got a lot of work to do, but we have frameworks in place that are helping drive our business. Data is a very different matter, and I'll come on to that in a second. But I've got one slide on content, and I don't really need to tell you why content is all important. I started out in this industry running a monitoring business, and despite the fact that we all talk about analysis and insights and data and everything else, at the heart of our business, at the heart of the Cision business, is still a very, very large monitoring business. And getting access to content is increasingly important, and it's increasingly seen as a strategic asset, not just a commodity. And it's not just about the NLA, and it's not even just about newspapers. I think the NLA is a useful model for what can be achieved if you work with publishers. And I appreciate it may not work in all markets, but it certainly worked very well for us. And we've gone beyond talking to the NLA just about getting access to newspapers to talking to the NLA and the PDLN about getting access to more useful metadata that sits behind the content that will help power our insights. But it isn't just about newspapers. We have now big strategic relationships with the likes of Twitter and Facebook and some of the third parties that they use to monetize their content. And that's the key. Anyone who has any content of any value is looking to monetize it. Barry said that this session would be a challenging one for the local audience because copyright is not a significant issue in this part of the world. And it's the same is true, I think, in many far-flung corners of the world. But I think it will become an issue everywhere. And certainly in Europe, we've seen markets that said it wasn't an issue, like Portugal, where I've got a business, 5 years ago, copyright, who needs that? Well, the world has changed, and copyright is relevant there. So publisher relations are really important. Having strong relationships with the likes of the NLA and all the relevant groups around Europe has helped turn us from, I think when I got involved in the industry, the relationships with the likes of the NLA and the publishers were not good. And we've transformed that, and that's transformed our access to content. My frustration is that that's great for the UK, but there isn't a level playing field in Europe, let alone the rest of the world. So I still go out to clients and say, yeah, we can provide a global service. And they go, oh, right, I want print content from Germany integrated into my service. And you go, oh, well, it's hard to get content from Germany. But don't worry, nobody else can do it either. So the fact that there's a big gap in our service doesn't matter. I'd like to address that. And one of the reasons I've attended the PDLN conference every year for the last however many is because I've been preaching to Andrew's colleagues around Europe about trying to create a level playing field in Europe. And we need to do that across the world, not just in Europe. That's it on content. Data is what I really want to talk about. And I don't need to tell you why data is so important. But some of you, I'm sure, read The Economist a few weeks ago that ran a lead story about data being the most valuable resource in the world. And the 5 largest companies in the world by market cap being Alphabet, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, they all trade as data companies. At the heart of their business is data about who's sharing what, who's buying what, who's talking about what. The story was actually not about them, it was about the requirement for legislation to manage these companies, because you've got these giants that are in control of 90% of the world's data. And it's critical, data is critical to our industry. We serve the PR and communications industry, and any PR conference over the last 5 years has talked about the need to become more digital, more technical, and more data-driven. The art of creating stories needs to be interwoven or be driven by smart data and insights. And there is so much data that enables us to really understand what consumers want, to target them with the right message at the right time. And that self-same data can then ultimately end up helping us prove value, prove return on investment. And just to be clear, that data includes a whole bunch of things. That includes employee data, customer data, audience data, or in the case of the Cision business, we have the world's largest journalist and influencer database. That is basically a database of personal information, and that has big implications for our business. It's so important to Cision that we have just hired a chief data officer, a guy called David Barker, who was chief data officer at Oracle Marketing Cloud. Kevin Ackroyd, our new CEO, brought him in. And he is entirely responsible for all data in the business apart from employee data. That sits within HR. But clearly data is absolutely at the heart of our product suite. Some of these ironically, data points might not be entirely accurate, but I think we have around 700,000 journalists in our database, and we've got over 1 million other influencers in there. But it's also at the very heart of our business. We have 3,500 employees in over 15 markets, and the data protection environment in those markets has changed fairly radically in the last few years. One of the big things that we talk about in our marketing is how having really accurate, relevant, up-to-the-minute data helps improve targeting. One of the single biggest challenges facing PRs today, getting the right message to the right audience at the right time. Doing that effectively requires us to gather and deliver accurate data. Data about influencers and consumers is also key to our future model. One of the things that Cision will try to crack in the next few years is the link between activity and outcome. We are very proactively and quite publicly talking about working with publishers to gather the data that will allow us to push out content on behalf of our clients and track that all the way through to somebody clicking on a link that will take them to a site where they'll end up buying product. And we'll be able to then report that back to our users. But that relies on us being able to do that in law. And that's a pretty challenging process. So there's a big publisher relations exercise there, and there's also a big legal and compliance exercise. This is a busy slide, so apologies, but it was put together by my data protection and legal team. So it's been checked over, and they have told me it can be publicly shared. But basically, it talks about the fact that data protection has become a really significant issue in our business. It is probably the single most talked about kind of external legal issue at an executive level in the last 12 months. And certain markets have had, we've seen sort of spikes in conversations in markets like Germany, for example, where we've had to hire a data protection officer locally to comply with local legislation to be able to share information about both our employees and also about the journalists and influencer data that we sell to our customers. So we've had to change policies from opt-out to opt-in various markets. We absolutely don't go around scraping content from third-party sites such as LinkedIn, etc. And we have got an in-house legal team who are in part dedicated to this issue. We also use external counsel in specific markets like Germany where we need to. We conduct regular audits. As I said, we've got data protection officers in place. and we register with the appropriate local authorities to make sure that we are compliant in every market. Because you can imagine Cision, a business that's about to go public, is in the public eye. It's gone from being a relatively small business to a relatively large business in a fairly short space of time. So a lot of people are looking to pick holes in our offerings in local markets. So compliance is a really big issue for us. And obviously, the legislation is changing. Next year, there's a significant piece of legislation coming into force in Europe, which will force everybody to act and become compliant. And the other issue for us as an American company, and this is both an internal and external issue, we've recently rolled out a global HR system, which we had to switch off in certain markets because of the changes in the safe harbor legislation, which meant that we couldn't be sharing employee data from Germany again, to name one example, with the global HR team in the US without making significant changes within the business. So again, we took legal advice and we put protections in place to make sure that that we're compliant. But this has all come at significant cost of time, expense, and advice. My advice to you is you need to get up to speed on the legislation and act now. I'm going to finish with looking to the future. My vision of the future in 2020 isn't particularly radical because it's not very far away. But I would say look to the past. I think we've come a long way on the content side, as I said at the beginning, and I'm sure we will do on the data side as well. I think you all need to see content and data as strategic assets if you don't already. Regulation is moving all the time. Markets that think it isn't a problem because they're currently unregulated, those markets will look to others around them and will change pretty dramatically. So I would suggest that you get ahead of it and make sure it doesn't become a strategic problem. Finally, I think partnering with strategically important content owners is becoming increasingly important, and we have a whole department within Cision that now focuses its time, energy, and attention on doing that. Because we are nothing without access to content. We are nothing without the ability to share data.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hughes. I'm employed by the newspaper licensing agency in the UK, but I don't want to talk about UK and I don't want to talk about newspapers. I want to talk about the principles of how we bridge the gap between content owners and content users in a way that enables business to work well. I'm also, as Christophe has mentioned, General Secretary of a sort of AMEC equivalent for content licensing organizations, which is called the Press Database and Licensing Network. The website is there if you want to go have a look. And that is not as big as AMEC. I'm going to be helping run the conference we have in Athens in a couple of weeks' time. I think 1 or 2 people here are coming to that. But we will be probably 50 people. It will be a little bit more low-key. And I think that probably reflects the fact that the area I work in is less developed. I mean, we've all been through fabulous and fantastic rates of change in the last 15 or 20 years. I think content licensing is definitely evolved in that period, but it needs to keep evolving. Jeremy talked a little bit about Barry's concern that copyright might seem a slightly alien concept to those of you in the audience from Asia. Actually, we have seen in PDLN in the last couple of years 5 members from the Asian area, 2 from Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Australia. So, copyright is a global concept. It's underpinned by the Berne Convention, which is signed by, I think, every country in the world except Tonga or something. It's there and it's real. Our job is to try and make it practical and try and make it work. And I keep coming back to this building bridges analogy, which I think describes quite well our role, which is we have to make a connection between a busy, under-pressure newspaper concerned about its future, or maybe some of our members are involved in audio and TV licensing, maybe a TV commercial director who's busy working on things. And we have to get them to understand what you guys do. And we have to get them to understand that you are, and respect the fact that you are serving the biggest companies in the world with business-critical data, and that you need access to their information. You need the rights to reuse their information in a defined way, and that you are happy to pay a fair, an appropriate fee for that, and maybe the users would pay too. So I think the challenge we have in building that bridge is a very big one. At the end of the day, the industry you represent, it feels it's a big industry. I mean, look around this week and look at the people you serve. But in absolute revenue terms, as a percentage of revenue for a typical newspaper publisher, these are small amounts of money. And the rights you want are pretty extensive. I mean, a lot of if you imagine your newspaper and someone says, well, this business wants to come along, it wants to copy everything on your website or everything in your newspaper, it wants to put it in a database, it wants to do this with it, that with it, extract meaning from it, and then sell it to somebody else. You have to, the challenge is to present the data they need that allows them to value that fairly. Their assumption will be their content is worth a lot of money. And one of the challenges we have, I think, especially with newspapers, is that they are very egocentric organizations. They are trained to believe in their brand, and they believe their content must be the reason people are buying your services. And then I have to explain to them that in Jeremy's case, years ago, it's probably a much bigger number now when it was just a UK business. 8,000 sources, you are one of those, and then, but is it big enough to be worth doing? And then you have to find a way that makes that work. That requires a good understanding of what you do. It requires the ability to communicate that. And I think it also requires the ability to collectivize that. If you did that for one newspaper, or if you went to every single newspaper and tried to do that, it's practically impossible. You need thousands of sources delivered under one agreement. And increasingly, you need access to data. I mean, Jeremy mentioned an initiative we had in the UK which got the usage data from the websites to feed back into the evaluation area. That is the publishers opening up very sensitive information to enable you to do your job better. But yeah, when you're getting to newspaper paywalls on web content, which a lot of people have been using, these things become more important. But if you can build the bridge, if revenue and content can flow in opposite directions across that bridge in the right way, then everyone has a better and more secure future. I've answered only the three of the four questions that were put to me in this, and I'm being very direct on those. I think one of the questions was, are relationships enough? When I look in some countries, and the nice thing about my PDLN job is that I get to visit a number of different countries. Clearly, everyone is different. Systems have evolved in different ways depending on local practice, and in some areas, this is a very informal kind of understanding. Well, I've told the big publishers what I'm doing, so we don't need a contract. We don't need to tie ourselves up with the lawyers. Is that enough? Well, it can be enough, and I always like the concept of Chinese deals, which is you each know what you're doing, and you each agree it so well you don't need to write it down. Well, that's great, but to make that practical across 8,000 sources is probably not great. Especially when you go to sell your business and Cision come along with their big checkbook and try and buy it, they're going to want to know on what basis are you using this content. You say, well, I know Jim in the advertising department. He said it was okay. I don't think it's really going to, it's going to wash. So I think formalization of this, if it's done in the right way, can be healthy for everyone. Maybe actually before I go to that, I didn't put a slide together on data, but I mean there is Data is important to our business. In the system we've set up in the UK, we have a huge level of transparency in the media monitoring business on actually who is using what content, down to the individual level, because we engineered this central system which created that transparency. We did that to drive the licensing opportunity, but it certainly creates the kind of data protection issues that Jeremy was aware of, and certainly the European perspective on that is very different from the US perspective, and the regulations are tightening. But I think the key to this, there is a legal review process, there is whatever, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of these things, it's a bit like copyright as well. A lot of these things are about common sense. If you behave with respect towards other people's property, you're going to be okay, and if you behave with respect to other people's data, you're going to be okay. So to close, I think, yeah, it's good to try and look forward and think about what the future might be, and think about whether you're ready for the future. And the work you do in this area takes a while, so you need to have a strategy, and you need to think about where the world is going. Certainly in the area of newspapers, we've been through an extraordinary 20 years. I remember being in New York in 1994 with someone from Newsweek, or one of the major US weeklies, a woman called Carol Ginsberg, and she'd say, "Hey Andrew, come and look at this." And she was looking at the online version of a newspaper and saying, "Isn't it wonderful your publishers are giving all this information away for free?" And I think we're coming towards the end of this period of, certainly in the professional news industry, of information being available for free. You've seen the paywalls coming because the business model doesn't work without payment for content. And that's going to continue. I think certainly the newspapers are in somewhere between structural and terminal decline. Please don't quote my bosses on that one, but I think most of them would recognize that. Certainly the structural decline phrase is pretty clear. And they're going to be looking for new revenues. And you are going to be looking at a world where your access, the volume of content that's printed is reducing, your access is sharply reduced because the web goes away. And the services you get from various people suddenly start looking a bit different. And you're also going to be facing publishers who are looking for new sources of revenue. When they look at your community, which is thriving and growing and the rest of it, quite a few newspaper executives are going to say, "Hey, that looks like a revenue opportunity." I think you also need to recognize the extent to which copyright licensing is becoming international. I mean, in the period that PDLN has existed, less than 10 years, we have seen licensing regimes spring up in Poland, and with our active, and my personal active encouragement, in Poland, in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, and, you know, in Asia, things are moving. Look at Japan, watch what's happening there. 2 or 3 years' time, there will be something there. And you need to think about making sure you take the initiative. If you go to someone who's not expecting something with a small sum of money and a very clear story, they're going to shake your hand, say thank you much, and sign a deal. And then you can get on with your business and they can get on with ours. There's a little bit of maintenance to do. But you will be better off if you make that investment and make friends and create a secure basis for developing your business in the future. The businesses are very different. The crossover needs to be managed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to ask first a question to you, Andrew. I mean, what is the main challenge? I started to say that you are the intermediary between us and between the publishers. Do the publishers understand our industry? And what are the main challenges for you when you face them to explain our industry?
I think the publishers don't understand your industry. And I think they don't understand it because It's one of many industries that reuses and repackages news content. The businesses they have to understand are essentially advertising, where they're not having a very happy time at the moment, and circulation, where they're not having a very happy time at the moment. They don't have the bandwidth to understand multiple downstream businesses. The challenge, I think, is getting bigger all the time there, and the challenge is to make them understand that there is an opportunity here to pursue, but not an opportunity that is so big it will change the course of their business. And for a lot of newspapers, they are seeing revenue declines of 10% a year in Europe. It's rather different, I think, in other areas, but America, if anything, is worse. Asia is not so bad yet, but they're in a period of intense decline. They're very stressed, and to make that connection with them and to get them to trust even the licensing body, let alone the users of the licensing body, is not getting easier. Where we have good case studies, it helps, but it's not easy.
Okay. I have another question about the international environment. I know that you don't want to speak about the NLA, but the NLA grants the right to other right organizations. What is the value for the final client for this?
I think the one thing anyone has to do is, I mean, we use the analogy of these phones when we are in internal discussions in PDLN. It came from one of Thomas Vellman's predecessors at Infomedia, which is that if you do enough work behind the scenes, you can, this phone, I can pick it up and dial anyone anywhere in the world. How is that possible? And I get billed back in the UK. If you make that possible, by doing the work to build the connections behind the scene, it's easy for the user. And I think the phrase we are trying to get into everything we do is trying to make it easier. It's very, it's a danger for copyright bodies because they start with taking all the requirements of the different publishers and they put them together. They end up with something which is complex and difficult for you to operate. And then 3 years later, the model has changed and your model has changed and the license doesn't work anymore. We have to really work hard with the publishers to make sure that we can present something simple to you. Because if it's not easy, it won't be used. And one of my beefs is, one of my projects is to try and make it easier for people in the room to use UK content. So we developed first a model based a little bit too much on content supply. We've changed that model and tried to make it easier to recognize the way that data is used. The big challenge is to make it easy, and if you can do that, that helps. So we have at NLA engaged in what we call swap reciprocal deals with licensing bodies in Spain, Portugal, France. Germany, it's one way, but we're trying to make it easy for MMOs in other countries to get the UK rights from their local MMO. We've done it with Australia, for example. And the intention is to simplify life because the feedback I get about some of our offerings are, yeah, we are relatively expensive, but that's not really the issue. It's too complicated. And that's why people don't do it. And so you have to
They're ready to pay, but they want simple models.
Yeah, it must be simpler. And I think, Christophe, you have been quite helpful from the AMEC and FIBEP perspective of pushing that message, and we hear you. Okay.
Jeremy, how do your clients react with copyright? What is the part, what is the time spent by your sales guy on copyright?
Well, first off, I think the clients are not quite as ready to pay in all cases as you might think. I think pretty much at any point in time, just in the UK, we always have one major client who's refusing to pay a copyright bill. There is one at the moment, I'm sure you're aware of. And I think the issue is manifold. I mean, first off, I think because it's a sort of cost layered on top of the service, I think we do a much better job of explaining it. I mean, Jason used to run my sales team some years ago, so he will know firsthand what it's like. But I've been in pitches with Jason and others where you always get to the bit at the end, yeah, tell us about copyright. And in the past, I think the sales teams at that point would start looking at their shoes or try and avoid the question. Now we're much better briefed. We have training sessions with the NLA. We are proactive in providing information. We don't try and, avoid the subject. But I think part of the issue is the clients don't get it because they, in some cases, they think, well, we're powering the content. That was a story that we seeded. Why are we paying to get it back to us? They have an issue with that. In some cases, the clients are major advertisers. They will say, well, we spend X million a year with the Times. Why should we pay to receive content back from the Times as well as paying to advertise along that self-same content, which in some cases we created in the first place? So I think it's a particular issue with the PR industry because they have a particular perception about their participation in creating content. And I don't know what the figure is, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of all content in UK newspapers is generated by a press release, so ultimately by PR.
And for your sales team, this is an issue?
It is an issue, maybe less of an issue than it was, although the NLA meltwater case in the UK muddied things for a while. People suddenly thought everything was going to be free, and it wasn't. So I think we're in a relatively good place locally. The problem comes, I know that my sales team at times historically have walked away from European or global deals because the minute they hear that a client wants content from 100 markets, all they think is that, rather than thinking that's an amazing opportunity, they'll think that's impossible to deliver. And you're walking into a minefield. So I think that's the key issue that we really need to address. I think, in local markets, people have good local frameworks that work well for their local businesses. But I don't think anybody in the room who is in the business of selling media analysis and insights powered ultimately by monitoring would say that we have in any way cracked the ability to sell European or global services. And that's because we can't get access to content on a sort of level playing field. And it's even more complicated to explain to clients. And the cost in some markets is just prohibitive.
I am going to the data IDs and issues. Do you think you underline in your presentation that even our customers' data are protected and we don't know this? Now we have to know it. Do you think this legal environment is a threat or a risk for our industry? I know that Andrew, as he explained, prefers agreements between the stakeholders instead of legal environment. And you do think that legal environment for data is a risk for our industry?
Well, clearly it's a risk if it's not managed, but I think regulation and licensing and frameworks, if implemented properly, provide access to content in a more systematic fashion. So it should be an opportunity, but I think we'll go through this transition period where everybody's running around trying to protect their businesses, trying to shore up data that they were scraping or grabbing or taking on an opt-out basis, left, right, and center. They'll have to address that, and that will be costly. It'll be time-consuming. But at the end of the day, regulation is there to protect consumers, protect employees, protect individuals, but also I think it protects our businesses, because if we all operate on a level playing field and access to content and data is available but controlled, I think that's preferable to operating in a kind of a chaotic environment where everybody's just trying to grab whatever they can in whatever kind of ramshackle fashion they do it, and where there is no regulation and no protection. But I do think there'll be a period of 2 or 3 years where lots of businesses will not react to this. Lots of businesses will be unprotected, and they will suffer the consequences of that if they don't do something about it.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question in the room? Yes, Thomas?
Thomas from Infomedia. It's an extension to what we're talking about with the European legislation, especially on privacy data. Your view or perspective on social media data. To be in business, I need to do deals with Twitter, Facebook, whatever. I don't have the power to dictate rules. How do you see the organization around this in our industry?
I think the regulation will impact the likes of Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn every bit as much as it impacts us. So I think that's a good thing. The Economist article was all about the requirement for governments to act now to regulate the big data providers so that they can't hold individuals or companies to ransom. I think many of us in the room will have seen Twitter going from being a source that everybody could just grab, aggregate and distribute to one that suddenly got shut down left, right and centre all over the place, except to one or two existing providers who were allowed to carry on selling the full Twitter feed. So I think regulation will be good because it will stop some of those data providers from leveraging the power of that data at our expense. So I would like to see a world where everybody has access to the right data and the right content from all sources at the right price in common formats that make it easy for us to do our business. I think access to data and content is a strategic question, but it shouldn't be. I think that for people in the room who are selling analysis and insights, having exclusive access to a set of data or content that no one else in the room can have, I think that's wrong. I think we should make our money and add value in what we do with that data and content and the insights that we churn out for our clients. That's what we're really good at. So the fact that company A can get access to the full Twitter feed and company B can't because they're not willing to pay the price or they didn't have the license in place at the right time, I think that's just wrong. So I think regulation is a good thing, but I suspect it'll be painful in the short term and it'll take a while to settle down.
We have 2 minutes for a last question. Yeah.
Germany, short remark, there is German content available, so it's not like you can't buy it. Maybe the regulations are somewhat different compared to the NLA. But my question is to Jeremy. As far as I know, the regulation of personal data of journalists, but as well private persons, is until now regulated on a national basis. How do you deal with that? Because as far as I can see, it's just moving. So there are discussions on the EU level, and then you have the differences between today national, and then EU, and then you have US and maybe other markets. How do you deal with that practical? So what can you offer your clients with what time perspective?
It's an interesting question, and sorry, I didn't pick on Germany for any reason other than it's been the most active market for us in terms of data protection in the last 12 months. And my wife is German, so I have a particular interest in the market. She just arrived, actually. I should get her in to answer the question. But the way we manage it, what happened in Germany was Clemens Hammacher, who runs my German business, about 18 months ago, started telling us that this is going to become an issue. We started researching it. We hired local counsel. We now have a data protection officer in place locally. But the issue flared because one of our competitors who saw Cision coming into the German market said something at a conference in Germany about Cision not being compliant, and this got tweeted. And it, we addressed that issue with our lawyers, but it did highlight the point that people will try and pick holes in what we all do. So there is a requirement to be locally, nationally, and regionally compliant. We rely on the local managers to tell us when issues are kind of flaring, but also, it's the job of both in-house and external counsel to be advising us of regulation changes all the time and to be looking at how that impacts the business. And we have a team in Cision who are dedicated to talking to publishers, working with counsel to understand the changing legal environment, and we respond to it. And I think Germany has been very active, but I think we've taken all the steps in that market to comply with local legislation, to work with the local authorities, and we are very, very public about that, and we will do that everywhere.
We can add that the European Commission the Parliament voted a European law, a European directive on data, and it will start next May next year. So it will be an obligation to respect the data protection, and if you don't respect this data protection, you can have a fine of 4% of your income revenues. But of course, they will start with Facebook, with the biggest companies. And I think it's not really a threat for medium or small-sized company today, and we will have to wait perhaps 3 years or 4 years. But this is really an issue, and in Europe you can't do without respect this directive.
I should also add, if you engage with people like the PDLN, you guys are very good at informing us of changes in local markets, and I would encourage you to do more of that. Make sure everybody is aware of forthcoming legislation way before it happens, so that people have the time to react. Because currently I think the only winners in this are the lawyers. There's a lot of money being spent on legal fees, on understanding and then implementing.
Couldn't agree more. It's absolutely tragic when you don't resolve something at a business level. You do not want lawyers involved in this, and keeping the lawyers out is a big part of the implicit mission for us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Andrew. And